With the NFL's current 32 stadiums, 22 stadiums are outside, with no roof, no retractable roof, no dome. This means these games played at these fields are subject to the environmental conditions, weather, wind, rain, blizzard-like conditions, hot temperatures, cold temperatures. These games experience some type of weather. Who can forget these iconic Madden-like aerial shots that came from the Patriots versus Atlanta back in 2017 when dense fog overtook Gillette Stadium? We'll look through some of the most recent NFL games that were played in windy, snowy, rainy, bitterly cold, and hot conditions. And we'll see if the weather actually does impact NFL games. So a little background on where this question even arose from was I was in attendance at a non-NFL game. The Penn State Nittany Lions were hosting the Northwestern Wildcats at Beaver Stadium. This game saw 6 fumbles and 2 interceptions. That's right, 6 fumbles, 2 interceptions. The over-under for this game at kickoff was 50 points. Penn State was also heavy favorites in this game, being favored by 25.5 points. They didn't even come close to covering that spread. Why were there 6 fumbles, 2 interceptions? I think it had something partially to do with the fact that it was downpouring for much of the game. Tropical moisture from what was once Major Hurricane Ian had worked its way up the East Coast and had produced heavy rainfall throughout the state of Pennsylvania. The ground was quite muddy, conditions were slick, receivers were dropping balls, and we saw just how slippery the ball was as there were 6 fumbles and 2 interceptions. It was also pretty cold that day. It wasn't bitterly cold, but you combine cool weather with downpour, it makes for unpleasant conditions. Are professionals just as prone to making mistakes when the conditions aren't favorable? The same tropical moisture that brought downpour to the Penn State Northwestern game would conveniently bring a soaking rain to the Philadelphia Eagles Jacksonville Jaguar game in Philadelphia the very next day. Now, during that day on Sunday, Philadelphia saw close to 2 inches of rain. It was basically monsoon, which was practically identical to what happened in the Northwestern Penn State game at Beaver Stadium a day before. This was a perfect opportunity to compare professional athletes with non-professional athletes and see how they perform in rainy conditions. The Eagles-Jaguars game had almost as many turnovers as the Northwestern Penn State game did. In the Eagles-Jaguars game, there was 4 fumbles and 2 interceptions. And these are professionals we're talking about, but they played in adverse weather conditions and still turned over the ball 6 times. In the Northwestern Penn State game, 2 field goals were made. In the Eagles-Jaguars game, only 1 field goal was even attempted. It was made from 28 yards out. Whoop-de-doo. At Denver's Mile High Stadium, typically field goals are able to be kicked at longer distances as the ball will fly further through less dense air. Justin Tucker's NFL record 66-yard field goal was kicked in Detroit in the Dome, where weather played no impact on the kick. How convenient is that? Back in Philadelphia at Lincoln Financial Field, Jalen Hurts went a reasonable 16 for 25, 204 yards, no touchdowns, and 1 INT. Hurts would rush 16 times for a total of 38 yards, including 1 rushing touchdown. Overall, not a terrible performance by Jalen, but it certainly wasn't his best as he averaged 247 yards during the 2022 season. Even though Trevor Lawrence would throw for 2 touchdowns, Lawrence would fare much worse than Hurts, only managing 174 yards in the air, throwing 2 interceptions, and getting sacked 4 times. Not only was Lawrence sacked 4 times, but he also fumbled the ball 4 times as well. This was certainly an underperforming day for Lawrence, who averaged 241 yards during the season. The 4 fumbles obviously didn't help his team out much. For the Eagles, Miles Sanders rushed for 27 times for over 130 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. This game was largely played on the ground as the Jaguars and Eagles would combine for a 2-to-1 rushing to passing attempt ratio. The initial over-under line for this game was 48 points, but that dropped to 44 points at kickoff. But regardless of which line you took, the over would hit. Unlike the Nittany Lions, the Eagles were able to cover their -7.5 spread. Who doesn't love a good NFL game played in the snow? Sometimes snow becomes such an issue that the game isn't even played to begin with. Back in 2022, the Buffalo Bills took on the Cleveland Browns, except this game wasn't played at Orchard Park, New York. It was instead moved to Detroit's Ford Field, an indoor stadium, due to the immense amount of snow that fell on Orchard Park that day, over 6 feet. When the game was supposed to be played at Orchard Park, outside in the elements, the initial over-under line was 44.5, dropping as low as 41 points. However, when news got out that the game was being moved to Detroit's Ford Field, which is an indoor stadium, the over-under jumped from 41 points up 9 points to 50. While the act of actually changing an NFL venue to a neutral site is incredibly rare, most games played in the snow go on as scheduled. Back in 2013, the Philadelphia Eagles hosted the Detroit Lions, but this go around at Lincoln Financial Field, precipitation fell in the frozen form instead of the liquid form, producing one of the snowiest games in recent NFL history, as over 8 inches of snow would fall that day. Now, just like the previous 2 games that were played in heavy precipitation, this game was played heavily on the ground. LaShawn McCoy would run a franchise record 217 yards, including 2 touchdowns that came off of 40-plus yard runs. McCoy's efforts would help the Eagles overcome Detroit's 2 touchdown returns. Despite Detroit's 2 touchdown returns, though, their offense struggled significantly. The Lions' Matthew Stafford threw for 10 for 25, for only 151 yards in no touchdowns. Nick Foles didn't fare much better, only going 11 for 22 for 171 yards, including 1 touchdown but 1 INT. Just like in the other 2 games played in heavy precipitation, there was an almost inconceivable amount of turnovers in this game as well. Only 1 interception was thrown. That was largely in part because of the average yards per passing attempt went down significantly due to the heavy snowfall rates. However, Detroit's Matthew Stafford would fumble the ball 5 times, while the running back would fumble the ball 2 times. Collectively, out of these 7 fumbles, 3 of them they would lose. Nick Foles and company only fumbled the ball once, which they were able to recover. Both teams elected to try for 2 points after every touchdown. The only extra point attempt came after a penalty was called on the previous 2-point conversion try. That point after attempt failed. Not a single field goal was even attempted in this game, so for the entire game, the ball would never go through the uprights. The over-under for this game would hit right on the nose. Pre-game over-under line was 54. The Eagles would cover the 2.5-point spread, and get this, there were 0 sacks in the entire game. 0. There's a theory that warm season teams like, say, Miami or Jacksonville, or any other team that home's field is indoors, will struggle to play northern teams during the later half of the season. Because for these warm season teams, they're unable to acclimate to the harsher, cold conditions up north. Have you ever tried catching a football when your fingers are frozen? It's difficult even for somebody from the north to do, let alone somebody who's used to warm weather. In the modern NFL era, teams are loaded with high-tech equipment that keeps players warm for as long as possible. But once players come off the bench and onto the cold field, there's only so much this equipment can do. Additionally, in today's NFL, lengthy and frequent TV timeouts interrupt the pace of play, causing players to stand still and lose their body heat. Does a cold season team have advantage over a warm season team if they're traveling up north to play outdoors in cold conditions? In December of 2022, the LA Rams visited the Green Bay Packers at Lambeau Field. The high temperature that day was 20 degrees. By the 4th quarter, temperatures had dropped in the lower teens. Conversely, back in LA, the high temperature that same day was 65. This was a classic case of a warm season team traveling up north during the later half of the NFL season to play a cold season team outside in extremely cold conditions. LA's Baker Mayfield would go a disappointing 11 for 21 for 111 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Conversely, the seemingly cold-resistant Aaron Rodgers would throw 22 for 30 for 229 yards, 1 touchdown, and also 1 interception. 3 fumbles occurred in this game, but only 1 would result in a turnover. There was 1 missed extra point, but otherwise the field goal kickers went a perfect 3 for 3, including this 55-yard bomb by LA's Matt Gay. Out of the 52 total rushing attempts by both teams, no rushing attempt would go over 20 yards. Green Bay's Nixon would return a kick for 52 yards, perhaps having something to do with the density of cold air. Since colder air is more dense, there's less hang time from each kick. With less hang time, there'd be less time for the coverage units to get to the kick returner. This would allow the kick returner to have more time and more yards to run upfield before getting challenged by the opposing team. Now keep this idea in your back pocket as we'll revisit it in a moment. The Green Bay Packers were 7.5-point favorites going into this game, and they proved why they were the kings of the frozen tundra. The Packers had an obvious control of this game from kickoff. The cold season team had a clear advantage over the visiting warm season team. Very next week, the cold weather followed Green Bay down to Miami of all places. Miami's Christmas of 2022 was the coldest Christmas on record. The high temperature was only 50. Only 50. Although this might not seem very cold to most people north of Florida, any Miami native can tell you once the temperatures drop to 60, let alone 50, the long sleeve, jackets, Uggs, boots, everything comes out. This go around, however, Green Bay were the underdogs as the Miami Dolphins were 3.5-point favorites. The seemingly cold immune Rodgers would throw 24 for 38, including 1 touchdown and 1 INT, while Tua Tagovailoa threw for a more than respectable 310 yards, going 16 for 25 with 1 touchdown and no interceptions. However, it seemed like the Miami cold got to the tropical native as Tua would throw 3 interceptions. The Dolphins collectively would also fumble the ball 3 times, however only 1 fumble resulted in a turnover. Now remember how colder air is more dense and thus any kicks would have longer airtime? Well, Green Bay's Nixon would once again have a fantastic return day, including 1 return where he went 92 yards. However, he somehow managed not to score on a 92-yard return. Collectively, the Packers and Dolphins would combine for 6 for 7 on field goals. But just like back in Green Bay, the warm season team, Miami Dolphins, were the only team to miss a field goal. Now, granted, it was a 48-yarder, which is no chip shot, but still. Green Bay had no issues dealing with what I'm sure they consider balmy conditions after playing in 20-degree weather a week before up in Wisconsin, while the Dolphins seemed to slip under the cold conditions not typically seen in Miami. Green Bay would earn an underdog win holding off the Dolphins. The under would hit with the pregame over-under line set at 49.5. So once again, it seemed like the cold season team had the advantage over the warm season team, except this time it was a little different where the warm season team actually saw the cold conditions at their home turf. If you made it this far into the video, it hopefully means that you enjoy the content that you're seeing, and you haven't just forgotten your phone on YouTube's autoplay somewhere on the counter. So please consider giving this video a thumbs up if you enjoy the content. To a cold season team having an advantage over a visiting warm season team. Does a warm season team have an advantage when a visiting cold season team comes down and plays in the heat? Did you know, and this is a real fact, milk production goes down in heat-stressed goats? Well, Tom Brady definitely saw production loss when he played in a very hot game versus the Jacksonville Jaguars back in 2018. In mid-September, the New England Patriots traveled south to Jacksonville, playing in nearly record-setting heat in Jacksonville when temperatures would hit 96 degrees during the game. For some context, down in Jacksonville in mid-September, the average temperature is about 87 degrees, while the average mid-September day back in Boston hits about 73. The Patriots were used to 70-degree days during this time of the year. This game would be about 23 degrees warmer than what they are used to playing in. Tom Brady did not play his normal GOAT status style of football. He would go 24 for 35 with 2 touchdowns and no interceptions, which really isn't bad for an average QB, but this is Tom Brady we're talking about. Even though he didn't throw any interceptions, he did lose a fumble. Meanwhile, the Jaguars' Blake Bortles would thrive in the heat, going 29 for 45 for 376 yards and 4 touchdowns. Jacksonville would spread out the passing love as 9 receivers would go for 10-plus yards. So was the Jaguars' offense just clicking on all cylinders, or did the New England defense just really struggle playing in the heat? They wouldn't even record a single sack. There was only 1 missed field goal, and it was made by the Patriots. Now, it was a 54-yarder, but talking about one of the best kickers to ever play in Stephen Gostkowski. So another underdog would come out on top, as the Jacksonville Jaguars would down the New England Patriots. Now, if I told you in today's NFL style of play that a team would only complete 2 passes and they would end up winning the game, would you believe me? I wouldn't believe me. But that was exactly what happened when the Patriots took on the Bills in Buffalo back in 2021. Rookie QB Mac Jones would throw the ball just 3 times in this entire game. He would only complete 2 for 19 yards. The Patriots would end up winning. How is this possible? What happened? Well, throughout this game, the winds were gusting past 40 miles an hour. The wind was howling. It was an incredibly blustery game. The Buffalo Bills' Josh Allen would throw 30 times, but he would only complete 15 of those passes for only 145 yards. There was no interceptions in this game, it was only 33 passes. So the way the Patriots were able to win by only throwing 3 passes, only completing 2 of them, was on the ground. The Patriots would run for a combined 222 yards, while the Bills only recorded 99 yards on the ground. 3 of the 4 field goal attempts would be successful. However, the longest field goal on the night was only 41 yards. There were 11 punts during this game, including a 71-yarder by the Patriots. The Bills were favored by 3 points. As the underdogs, the Patriots would come out on top. The over-under line was as high as 45 points at one time, but once news got out that this game was going to be played in blustery conditions with 40-mile-an-hour plus gusts, it dropped to 40 points. But even with that low over-under, the under would still hit. Now, these games were such a small sample size and were picked because of their extreme weather conditions. But from what we discussed today, it seemed that pretty obviously that weather played some type of role. So what do you think? Does weather actually impact NFL games? Or do we give Mother Nature too much credit? Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you all take care.